Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we're going to look at the bigger implications of what's going on, especially with the arrest of Julian Assange, but that's just part of the story. We're going to look into the bigger picture as we usually do, but it appears that the gloves are off, but is the clampdown on the way? Now, this week we look at the present and future restrictions which look likely to be placed on those who do not subscribe to fake news and imposed opinions and beliefs. Before we get into why the doors are closing and how, Per from Sweden supplied some comments on the Brexit disaster, which I'm going to read out. He says, Jacob Rothschild wrote in the London Times the day before the referendum that a Leave victory would spell disaster for Britain. He wasn't joking. Theresa May's main task is to deliver that disaster on behalf of Rothschild, and she's doing an excellent job. Couldn't have put it better myself. Also commenting on the arrest of Julian Assange, he says every Briton must be bursting with pride over their wonderful democratic regime. I also saw Brexit has been postponed until October 31st. 3 years and counting, exactly. The question is, do you really think the Brexit story will end any differently than the Assange story? And that is really the theme of tonight's show. I would say, well, probably, or most definitely not. It would be nice to see May facing treason charges, though, in our dreams. But today is the darkest day in the history of press freedom in the West, all courtesy of the criminal regime in Britain, adds Per from Sweden. But in a surprising and unexpected moment of clarity, get this, Labour MP Diane Abbott argued in Parliament that WikiLeaks had lifted the veil on US military operations in a variety of theatres, none of which have produced a favourable outcome for the people of those countries. So that was unusually accurate and perceptive for Diane Abbott to come out with that there. But getting on to the Assange story, the Russian Foreign Ministry has said the manner in which the UK government executed the arrest of Assange is a blow to journalism. The prosecution and persecution of Julian Assange is meant to silence others who would speak out against abuses of power. So say WikiLeaks editor Christine Hafnson and Assange lawyer Jennifer Robinson, who say they are promising to fight back. Let's see if they do. Now, the American Civil Liberties Union, it's a guy called Ben Weisner of the American Civil Liberties Union, released a statement highlighting the serious danger Assange's prosecution would pose for all journalists. Now, this is the point. He said, any prosecution by the United States of Mr. Assange for WikiLeaks publishing operations would be unprecedented and unconstitutional and would open the door to criminal investigations of the other news organisations, he said. Really good point, that. And that's where this show's going. That's what we're going to be looking into. Excuse me. Prosecuting Assange wouldn't only endanger non-American journalists. According to Weisner, this attack on press freedom is a two-way street. Well, yes, it opens the door to anything. And what about the less well-known purveyors of fact over fiction? They can be taken down with relatively no publicity, as those silenced will not be allowed to argue, as they will have been wiped from the internet overnight or actually even sooner. And as the net widens, a Swedish software developer who is alleged to have links to WikiLeaks was arrested in Ecuador. Ecuador's interior minister has confirmed that a founder of WikiLeaks has been arrested as he attempted to take a flight to Japan. Ecuador's interior minister, Mario Paulo Romo, said on Thursday that a man was taken into custody in one of the airports as he was about to board a plane to Japan. She also mentioned 2 Russian hackers. What a surprise there, eh? Also, Ola Bini, a software developer linked to Julian Assange, was arrested at Quito Airport. A senior Ecuadorian official says a Swedish software developer living in Quito and who is allegedly close to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange has been arrested as authorities attempt to dismantle a blackmail ring that in recent days had threatened to retaliate against President Lenin Moreno. Now, this is starting to sound like a coup against all alternative media, what I'm seeing here. Again, this is going to be the general thrust of tonight's show, is where things are going. But the official said Ola Bini was arrested Thursday at Quito's airport as he was preparing to board a flight for Japan. This, of course, opens the doors to associate anybody who has any link, real or fake, to WikiLeaks to be associated with Assange and taken down. And we know how easy that is. The actual guilt by association, this is the oldest trick in the book. And that's the way it works over and over again. Now, on to what Hillary Clinton had to say. She said, I do think it's a little ironic that he may be the only foreigner, that's Assange, that this administration would welcome to the United States. Clinton quipped back, it was on stage at a speaking event actually in New York, that she said this, chuckling at her own wit and basking in the audience's mirth, it says here. WikiLeaks published thousands of incriminating and embarrassing private email messages, this is the point, stolen from former Clinton Chief of Staff John Podesta and the Democratic National Committee in the run-up to the 2016 election, exposing extensive corruption and malfeasance on the part of the Clinton campaign. Many, including Clinton herself, believe the leak cost her the election. Well, here's another insight, again from Per in Sweden, who sent me a lot of material this week. He says the emails that especially come to mind were those between Clinton and Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, wife of Evelyn de Rothschild. The emails revealed not only Clinton's adoration of the Rothschilds, but also her absolute subservience to them. Well, there's no surprise with those two statements whatsoever, really. So, as we all know it, what's happened really, anyone who's been listening to the news, we'll recap slightly and go over some new points about this. Assange was charged with conspiring with Chelsea Manning in 2010. That's according to the DOJ statement. United States officials have announced that WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange had been charged with conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. He was arrested by UK police on the premise that he jumped bail in the UK. A London judge has found Julian Assange guilty of failing to surrender to bail in 2012. Now, that's all that's happened this week. In clearly prejudicial and unwarranted remarks from District Judge Michael Snow, who called Assange a narcissist and his behaviour shameful and who cannot get over his own selfish interests. Now, this was said by this judge for maximum effect, as is anything said by a judge. So it was clearly prejudicial, these statements. And they were made at an arraignment hearing where Assange should have just entered a plea and the judge should have said nothing prejudicial. But of course he did, knowing that it was going to get out into the media. And that's the character assassination really kicking into gear when it comes from a district judge. But there's no surprise there. And this has been my experience of what's happening in this country over the past few years, that the prejudice against what are in effect victims is actually massive. But this alone is evidence of extreme bias and character assassination. It says here, the WikiLeaks founder will be sentenced on May the 2nd. Julian Assange has been held at Belmarsh Prison, a notorious jail in southwest London that's earned the moniker of Britain's Guantanamo Bay, basically because they house so many of these alleged terrorists. But as WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy by British police, he emerged clutching a single book. This is the book he was holding. It was Gore Vidal's The History of the National Security State. Now, it's a book which describes the historical events which gave rise to the establishment of the military-industrial security complex and the political culture that gave us the imperial presidency. So this is really interesting. Now, later, as he sat in the dock at Westminster Magistrates Court, Assange silently read through the book before he was found guilty of skipping bail in 2012 and remanded in custody. Now, speaking through his lawyers from a jail cell, Assange appeared to tell supporters on Thursday his arrest was inevitable in the age of the national security state. I told you so, he said. Now, appearing with this book, it's the stuff of movies, as far as I can see, and it will actually make a very good movie, and also it's a very good move by him as well. But when a film about all this is made, then that alone will make a great scene. But Assange had pleaded not guilty to the charge, which stems from the time he sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012, avoiding extradition to Sweden for a sexual assault investigation. Now, most people remember all that. Although Swedish authorities dropped the charge in 2017, Assange remained wanted by Britain for breaching the terms of his original bail. Now, if the charges were later dropped, doesn't that invalidate the need for bail? The whole thing is obviously so orchestrated, and the way it's been put into the press and the reactions from the new puppet Ecuadorian president and what he said, it all fits into place. So, interestingly, does it invalidate the need for bail? Because the police use breaches of bail conditions all the time. Often the people who are wanted for bail breaches are not even aware that they're wanted. This is a really important point I wanted to bring up. And as we've previously reported, the bail conditions in some cases are very loose, and the police have used the disorganised court system where people are not even aware they've been summoned as an excuse to sort of demonise people publicly. And we have reported this widely, obviously on sites such as Crime Stoppers, which we actually helped to curtail after we provided the police had acted with extreme bias towards people they put on the site, which is after our evidence, after our evidence was presented. That site, Crime Stoppers, is pretty redundant, and it's not used by any forces regionally, just a few pages nationally now. But that's a really important point about this bail issue, that there's many cases where it's completely unfair and this sort of thing shouldn't be happening. It also ties into the Assange case here, but as we've previously reported, yes, do look into that. Do look into that Kent Police crime farming. We did many shows on it, and it's absolutely fascinating, and it gives an overall picture of what is happening within the judiciary and the police. Moving on from the bail issue, the US indictment against Julian Assange alleges that he engaged in conspiracy with US Army soldier Chelsea Manning, previously Bradley Manning, in 2010, and that's according to a statement from the US Department of Justice. It appears the hacking allegations were that Assange helped to hide the online identity of Manning, which is actually, that's really normal practice for journalists in an ideal world, or even a just totalitarian one. But the backlash from Ecuador is also extremely public. Now, Ecuador's former president, Rafael Carrera, slammed his successor, Lenin Moreno, for allowing police to arrest Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy in London, calling the action a crime humanity will never forget. Well, it's a crime against journalism, and it sets a precedent. This is really what's going on. Lenin Moreno stated, "I announced that the discourteous and aggressive behaviour of Julian Assange has led to the situation where asylum is unsustainable and no longer viable." Well, that's an excuse if ever there was one. But President of Ecuador, Lenin Moreno, released a video with these statements at the same time as the WikiLeaks founder was arrested in London, so it all looks very orchestrated. Ecuador's foreign minister announced that the country had suspended Julian Assange's Ecuadorian citizenship, which he was granted at the end of 2017. And it was following this 2017 election that Moreno quickly moved away from his election platform soon after taking office. He reversed several key pieces of legislation, and which had been passed under his predecessor, which basically targeted the wealthy and the banks. So Moreno's not a globalist puppet at all then, is he? But he also reversed a referendum decision on indefinite re-election, which simultaneously would block any potential for Carrera to return. So basically, this is just like an organised coup. But surely not. It couldn't be. This just couldn't be happening. But it sounds like the work of a dictator. I mean, it says here, he effectively purged many of Carrera's appointments as well to key positions in Ecuador's judiciary and National Education Council via the CPCCST Council, which boasts supra-constitutional powers. So Moreno was also cozied up to the US, with whom Ecuador had a strained relationship under Carrera. So the global action plan of the deep state can be very persuasive, and no more so than in this instance. But also, following a visit from Vice President Mike Pence in June 2018, Ecuador bolstered its security cooperation with the US including major arms deals, training exercise and intelligence sharing. Now, the word intelligence is definitely overused when talking about the propaganda enforcers of the state. So it appears that in the big scheme of manipulation, the UK willingly plays its part. It's also interesting that Trump has completely distanced himself from WikiLeaks after repeatedly saying he loved WikiLeaks during his election campaign. Now, this is of course bigger than any president. But let's get back to the UK. And the failed May regime may be coming to an end. But the vipers in the nest have already surrounded the leader of the UK Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, as he's now touted to be the next Prime Minister. This was announced over the last few days in the British mainstream press. And if that's what the process say, it must be true, or is it already in the process of being manipulated into reality? Well, very interesting all that, isn't it? So let's carry on with the show. And Theresa May. So if that's what the press say, well, I suppose it must be true. Or is it already in the process of being manipulated into reality? Will Corbyn stand up to the subversives in his party? The subversives who have already played their hand and are still subverting? Well, also reported this week was how momentum is controlling the Labour Party. This is very interesting. This was a little article in the Daily Telegraph. And it says that Corbyn should take control and break away from what is becoming a straitjacket. So that's really interesting because we did a really good show called Momentum and Labour Zionism. And that is really, really worth listening to because it outlines how John Landsman and Momentum have basically surrounded Corbyn so that he can't move. And that's what this article was really about. That Corbyn should maybe break away from this Momentum straitjacket because he's been hijacked through it. So see our show Momentum and Labour Zionism, which looks at the founder of Momentum, John Landsman, and his companies and machinations which have really effectively stifled Corbyn. And in my opinion, he needs to do something about that. So let's get back to the arrest of Julian Assange. Is it a sign of things to come? Well, yes, it would have to be, wouldn't it, really? Now, whatever you think of Assange, and I've never been sure that he's not compromised in some way, and in many ways just a front man. I've always had this kind of suspicion, but in a way that's beside the point. But if you're interested in that side of things, then it's actually worth looking at an article on nowhere.news, a very good website that's just started. They've done brilliant work on, of course, the Extinction rebellion, corporate-backed fake protest movement. They've done some really good articles on that, picking up from where we started off and actually going into some real detail and really brilliant articles. So do check that out. That's nowhere.news. But there is a story on there titled Reasons Not to Take the Julian Assange Story at Face Value. And it goes over his past and his connections to the state and their mind control cult called the family, which he was brought up into. If you want to read about that, you can find out a lot more in that article, and it's a very concise article. But that aside, the release of public interest information is under threat like never before, and that is the important issue here. The charges against Assange are stretching the credibility of the judicial system and the state. I think this is the most important point, and really the point about bringing this up in tonight's show, again getting into the bigger picture. What is this really about? His lawyer's comments put the issue into perspective, actually, and regarding the charges as well, but the media is in full-on attack mode now. Now, what was interesting was his sort of wizened appearance when he was dragged out. And this was also exploited for maximum effect. Also, allegedly being denied access to a razor, basically to make him appear unkempt. When he was dragged out in the daylight. And it was ironically reminiscent of the dazzled and unkempt Saddam Hussein when he was pulled out of his bunker. I mean, that's quite an interesting thing, isn't it? They've both been demonised by lies, which in Saddam's case and the Iraq War, WikiLeaks famously revealed. So I think that's quite an interesting point there. Now, the slander and negative associations are in full force, and stories of his alleged dirty protests, they don't seem to me to be credible, and are as usual over-egging, it's the press over-egging the pudding in the rush to turn public opinion against Assange here. Now, meanwhile, the pantomime carries on, and the honorary victim status of society's most useless is never far away from the public cesspit of mainstream fake news. Yes, we're going on to a little bit of comedy. Well, it's tragedy as well, but comedy always has to have an element of tragedy if it's good comedy. Now, a man who would never jump on a bandwagon, and he's always at the cutting edge of political debate, oh yes, the self-serving narcissist and plonker of the week award, goes once again to David Lammy, the Labour MP for Tottenham. Now, it is reported Labour MP David Lammy sparked a backlash after comparing Brexiteers to Nazis in a furious outburst. Now, as many outside the spectrum of fear and loathing know, the vocabulary of the hard of thinking is restricted to Nazi, fascist, racist or anti-Semite, throwing in, of course, Islamophobe, homophobe and a bit of transphobia for good measure. But the hardline Remainer, this is Lammy, claimed figures like Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg are similar to Hitler. Now, this comment is up there with the likes of Stella Creasy, Chuck Umunna, and a whole host of Blairite puppets in its absence of consideration and, most importantly, evidence. But Lammy has an incredible gift for making statements through his mouth, which are totally unconnected to his minuscule but self-serving and narcissistic brain. Now, he referred to previous reports of Boris Johnson meeting Donald Trump's advisor Steve Bannon and Jacob Rees-Mogg retweeting the far right, the so-called far right alternative for Germany, this German party. But are they really far right? Well, the far right is the MI5 and globalist catch-all for those outside the corridor of globalist newspeak, repeated by the repeaters and those with a lack of critical ability, bordering on imbecility, a bit like Lammy. But this carries on. When host Andrew Marr pointed out that Tory Brexiteers are elected politicians, good point that, Mr. Lammy blasted, "I don't care how elected they are. So were the far right in Germany." So how elected can you be? Are there margins of error? In Lammy's case, anyone would think so. But aren't Rees-Mogg and Boris a bit young to have been in the Nazi party? They say Prince Philip was a big fan of the Hitler Youth, but Mogg and Johnson, I just don't get it. But Lammy's mental age should be taken into consideration, but he is actually doing a job which carries some responsibility, which is actually meant for grown-ups. So I think that is the major point to address about David Lammy there. But he waffled on. He said, British soldiers in this country died fighting this thuggery and extremism, and here we are in 2019 with people bringing it into the mainstream for their political advantage. Now, does he mean that the people who also voted Brexit are Nazis as well? He seems a bit confused here about what his job is and what a Nazi is more particularly. But as usual, Lammy misses the target by 90 degrees and once again successfully shoots himself in the foot with his ludicrous comparisons. And of course, Lammy has never done anything for his political advantage, has he? Virtue signaller of the week, I think we had him down as, for on numerous occasions. But the bizarre rant was slammed by Tory MPs who warned they had lost respect for Mr. Lammy, previously hailed for his campaigning across the political spectrum. Anyone who had any respect for the likes of Lammy must have something amiss, though. Even being a Tory MP in this day and age is no excuse. And what campaigning? What's he talking about? Getting up and grandstanding for virtue signalling points is not campaigning. Tweeting support for issues is not campaigning. But again, show business is a fickle mistress, and that's what Lammy is in. He's basically in show business. Let's just carrying on here. Connor Burns said, I used to have regard for David Lammy, but this is batshit. comparing ERG to Hitler is quite something. Fully lost it. So let's see. Did he ever have it in the first place? He's just another one of those who were parachuted into positions of public office, and he's very good at pushing something completely removed from real issues. This is what he does all the time, which he would have to actually put some effort into. And there are important things which would take actual work rather than these meaningless sound bites and his endless virtue signalling. So I thought we'd have to make him, again, the not even the useful idiot of the week. The latest title of David Lammy there. And of course, he's not on his own, but we haven't got time to go into the rest of them. We'd be here all night. But let's get on now to the BBC, and basically the BBC and all news media who are backing the corporate-backed fake protest group Extinction Rebellion. Now, we talk about these nearly every week, but they're in the news every day, and they're being fully supported by the police and the mainstream media, and indeed indirectly by the government. Now, we revealed the nasty and sinister side to this globalist-backed cult in last week's show, and how they are absolutely set up like a Soros-backed organisation. And of course, they're very similar to Occupy with their consensus meetings, their facilitators, and their narrow corridor of accepted opinion, which is not based on fact. And it's based on a paper by the UN called the SR15, Special Report 15, which contains, guess what? No facts. But the Stinky Rebellion people haven't even heard of it. Go and ask one of them. Quite interesting, that. However, this week I received a message from a listener who was concerned about schools brainwashing kids into the fake apocalypse cult against the wishes of their parents. Now, this climate strike and Extinction Rebellion cult is a direct attempt to co-opt the young and gullible into the globalist narrative. The schools have no right to encourage this, and the fact that they are doing it is an insight into where this agenda is going. Now, my thought, well, let's put it this way. My thoughts are that it appears to me to be an updated version of the old Communist Party propaganda, turning kids against parents to get complete subordination by divide and rule by the corporate parent, the Stasi state. Now, this is also obviously through the UN and Agenda 2030, as we have reported time and time again, and as is featured in our talks, myself, Sandy Adams and Piers Corbyn, our talks entitled The Bigger Picture, which go into the global action plan, how it's orchestrated, why and who's doing it, and more importantly, what you can do about it. But having said that, the narrative is falling apart on many fronts. The problem is that the facts are not only in short supply, but rarely heard or just completely blocked and demonised, which is what we seem to have to report on every week now. But the dependence on mass brainwashing is the main driving factor behind the ER cult, as its founders know nothing about climate change. That's Gail Bradbrook and Roger Hallam. They admittedly know nothing about what they're talking about, and they're trained state-backed actors, and they've got links to the 5G rollout, Citizens Online, look it all up, and even the intelligence services through Stratfor. We reported that the other week. So if you're thinking of getting arrested and placed on a database for life on the back of a monumental lie, which you will come to regret, then go ahead. The state needs you and other narcissists to join the cult. Now, let's get on to more potential threats to reporting facts by independent sources, which is really the main thrust of tonight's show. This is a paper that's just been released called the Online Harms White Paper. Released April 2017. It was presented to Parliament by the Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, which is really a title of a very subversive agenda which is being played out through that role. And the Secretary of State, obviously, for the Home Department. And it's by command of Her Majesty, so she's to blame ultimately. Oh, I didn't know that, did you? Here we go. Let's see what the Online Harm paper says. Now, this is where we're getting into the draconian stuff on the back of what's happened to Assange. Now, let's see what it says. It says, Nearly 9 in 10 UK adults and 99% of 12 to 15-year-olds are online. As the internet continues to grow and transform our lives, often for the better, we should not ignore the very real harms which people face online every day. In the wrong hands, the internet can be used to spread terrorist and other illegal or harmful content, undermine civil discourse and abuse, or bully other people. Well, Bell Pottinger did pretty well out of it, producing ISIS videos, which were available through every mainstream media outlet in the world. But nobody banned them, did they, until they admitted being funded by the Saudis to make the nicely but rather ham-fisted direction on these videos. They were very, very flashy, and they had great tracking shots, but the main thing was terrible acting. They were totally unbelievable. But that's kind of a side issue. I mean, we've actually been branded as bullying by YouTube for interviews that we've put up by other people who are just giving their opinions. So where does this end? It doesn't really, does it? It can start and end anywhere, but it carries on. Online harms are widespread and can have serious consequences. 2/3 of adults in the UK are concerned about online content, and close to half say they've seen hateful content in the past year. Well, how do they define that? Hate can be defined to mean something that certain parties don't agree with, and it usually is. This is what the narrative of public opinion is all about, isn't it? It's about groups like Hope Not Hate deciding what is hate speak. Well, hate speak is anything they don't like. Now, the tragic recent events in New Zealand, it carries on, show just how quickly horrific terrorist and extremist content can spread online. Yes, and how New Zealand made it an imprisonable offence to share it on any media. Now, having watched that video, which was this Brenton Tarrant video, where he goes into the mosque and shoots all of these worshippers, there are many questions that arise as to its authenticity, but that's not the issue. The whole point here is to control the whole narrative. Again, the main thrust of what we're getting to in tonight's show, because what's happened in the past few weeks and this paper being brought into circulation along with Articles 11 and 13 of this new EU ruling, which may or may not come in regarding intellectual copyright, is very, very important, and we'll get into that as we go along. But it carries on, this harms paper, this online harms paper. It says, we cannot allow these harmful behaviours and content to undermine the significant benefits that the digital revolution can offer. Well, of course, I mean, this is the whole point of it, isn't it? That it's going to have to be absolutely controlled by the state. Okay, so it's the big we. Well, the we that they talk about, that's what we're talking about here. It carries on, while some companies have taken steps to improve safety on their platforms, progress has been slow and inconsistent overall, it says, meaning the cat is out of the bag, so let's put it back in quick. I think that's what they're trying to say here. If we surrender our online spaces to those who spread hate, abuse, fear and vitriolic content, then we will all lose. You see how they twist it? In other words, controlling the narrative is for the best. It's in everybody's best interests, isn't it? So lose our freedoms to disseminate information. That's what they actually mean. So it carries on. Let's have a look what they say in the next part. So our challenge as a society is to help shape an internet that is open and vibrant, but also protects its users from harm. Nanny state. So open and vibrant in newspeak means restricted and controlled. A single narrative repeated by everyone on TV and the newspapers, which is what AP and Reuters are there for. But this would also fulfill the meaning of diverse, because by diverse, they mean everything has to be the same and absolutely controlled and nothing outside it. That's what diversity means now. But the UK is committed, it says here, to a free, open and secure internet, really. Well, they've just contradicted themselves there, haven't they? And will continue to protect freedom of expression online. Well, freedom of expression that goes with the official narrative. That's what they actually mean. So, in other words, there's no vibrancy or diversity going on here, only in the way that they define it. We must also take decisive action to make people safer online. Well, isn't that good of them? Well, they've just contradicted that statement in the previous paragraphs. I don't know whether you noticed there, but it says here, carrying on, threats to our way of life. This is part 1 of chapter 22. The UK's reputation and influence across the globe is founded upon our values and principles. Well, whose values and principles are they talking about here? Well, it carries on. And here's another comedy section for you. Our society is built on confidence in public institutions. Is it? Is it really? Trust in electoral processes? Well, 17.5 million people might disagree with that. A robust, lively and plural media, are you kidding? And hard-won democratic freedoms that allow different voices, views and opinions to freely and peacefully contribute to public discourse. I mean, these people are having a laugh, aren't they? They've just contradicted all of that with what they've said. But whilst doing everything possible to stop it, that's exactly what they're doing. There are so many contradictions in that lot, it would take all night to address them. So I'll move on to 1.23. This point it says inaccurate information, regardless of intent, can be harmful. Well, anything can be harmful, can't it, in the wrong hands? But isn't this really about having critical thought and being taught to think? Oh, we're not taught to think, are we? I forgot about that. For example, it says here, the spread of inaccurate anti-vaccination messaging online poses a risk to public health. They had to get that in, didn't they? I mean, this is propaganda central. But fancy making an example of that, who'd have thought? It carries on. The government is particularly worried about disinformation. It says in brackets here, information which is created or disseminated with a deliberate intent to mislead. This could be to cause harm or for personal, political or financial gain. Well, when do people in Parliament ever do that? I think we've just addressed that in the first part of the show. Well, that's the BBC gone, I suppose. Great news. Yeah, that would apply to them, wouldn't it? Well, the government is particularly worried about disinformation. Well, that's the BBC. Or do they mean the opposite? The truth is fake news. I think that's probably what they mean here. Well, maybe we'd better get Snopes to investigate. Now, Article 1.24 of this says disinformation threatens these values and principles and can threaten public safety, undermine national security, fracture community cohesion and reduce trust. Well, what would they be reducing trust in? What they mean is that controlling the narrative of public opinion is the only thing that matters, and it will be done through fear and spreading misinformation. Let's go on to Article 1.25. These concerns, it says, have been well set out in the wide-ranging inquiry led by the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee report on fake news and disinformation, which was published on the 18th of February 2019, just before this. So, carrying on here, because I think this is important stuff. Online disinformation. This is box 12. Threat. It says online disinformation, spreading false information to deceive deliberately, never, is becoming more and more prevalent. Well, we do see that all the time, don't we? And then they go on to mention Russia as a main cause without giving any evidence as usual. And of course, fail to mention the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and its associated organisations, which post anti-Russian propaganda on an industrial scale. So they left them out. But this is Article 42. It said, according to Reuters Institute, 61% of people want the government to do more to separate what is real and fake on the internet. Well, we do, don't we? We want to get rid of people like CNN and the BBC. But maybe that's not what they mean. It says, so if you can't tell the difference, what it means is we're going to make your mind up for you. Well, that's okay then. We're safe. Brave New World kind of safe, combined with a hint of 1984. But it carries on in here. In December 2017, the Committee for Standards in Public Life, which was commissioned by the Prime Minister, published its report on intimidation in public life. The consultation sought views on a range of ideas, including establishing a new offence of intimidation. and requiring imprints on electronic campaigning. The report included examples of the extent of intimidation of those in public life. Now, this is where we get onto the narcissists and the idiots in public life who think having a few angry words thrown at them on Twitter is abuse. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not. That's not abuse, okay? When you can block somebody and you don't have to hear from them again, that's not abuse. Abuse is by an abuser who is constant in that abuse. When you have a choice in the matter, it's not abuse. Okay, so it carries on. It is hard to explain how it makes you feel. And this is Rachel McLean, MP. It is anonymous people that you've never met. True, but it has a genuinely detrimental effect on your mental health. Well, the mental health of MPs is something everybody should be concerned about. We've already talked about David Lammy and people like Stella Creasy and, of course, all the puppets like Chuka Ramona. I mean, their mental health should be examined because most of them seem to be suffering from narcissistic personality disorder. And I'm not qualified, but even I can see that. It says you are constantly thinking about these people and the hatred and bile they are directing towards you. Well, why would you be constantly thinking about that? Why wouldn't you be constantly thinking about what your duties were as a public servant? That's important, isn't it? It's called getting on with the job. I mean, this is just whinging on a grand scale. Absolutely unbelievable. And they're using it to take your rights away. So these MPs, people that you voted for, are actually working against you by using this against the public interest. If you're a public figure, deal with it. The most laughable thing is getting abused on Twitter. As we've said, no one gets abused on Twitter. You know, abuse is not someone spouting on the internet. The most subversive and useless MPs are the one who are bringing in this draconian clampdown. This is what we've got to remember, on the back of their alleged hurt feelings. She goes on. This is Rachel McLean. Oh, this is Jess Phillips now. Oh, yeah, great. These are great examples of public servants working in a public interest, aren't they? So, Jess Phillips, MP. I spoke on a number of occasions in the House of Commons in different committees about the rights of women. Well, she would, wouldn't she? Because it's all about virtue signalling, to which I suffered daily attacks on Twitter. No, you didn't. No one gets attacked on Twitter, right? On my email system, or endless online articles written about how people wish to see me raped. Well, we would need to see the screenshot of all these accusations because some of these things could actually be defined as criminal, but we never actually get to see most of these things that are meant to be deeply serious. We get to see the surface ones, don't we, where they've just had a few nasty words said about them. We know that people have been actually charged and put in prison. One of them was a bit unhinged, the one that went after the very popular Liverpool MP, Luciana Berger. And, of course, there's the Ruth Smith debacle. And, of course, these people are now part of this independent group. And they've been subverting things behind the scenes for a long time. The machinations of these change agents is legendary. But basically, I would need to see a screenshot of all these accusations. But what a lot of these public servants don't realise is that the public hate them for what they are. For their own reasons, which may have some validation. I mean, just because they make childish remarks doesn't mean that they haven't got good excuses or good reason to really dislike these people, because they are absolutely treacherous. Now, the MP for Swale, this was really funny, Gordon Henderson, who I had some interaction with as another useful idiot, announced his biography was out. This was on Facebook. It was incredibly funny. And there were genuinely abusive comments, but he didn't actually say anything. But basically, this was real abuse, right? So this Jess Phillips and this Rachel McLean, they should see what Gordon Henderson has said about him. And he does deserve it, in my opinion, because he's as useless as any of them with their nose in the trough, who are drowning in privilege. But these people still carry on in public office, and if they had any sense of integrity for the job, they would start listening to their constituents. This is the point, or resign. But they don't, do they? Now, let's get on quickly to the proposed EU Articles 11 and 13 and the tech industry concerns over this potential disaster for independent journalism. Now, this would massively restrict what can be put out and also threaten content retrospectively, which could then disappear overnight from the internet. And yeah, I'll kid you not, this is what it's about. A lot of people have been talking about this, but the Computer and Communications Industry Association issued this statement. Get this. The Computer and Communications Industry Association, public interest groups and many other stakeholders had in particular raised concerns about the proposed Articles 11 and 13. Article 11 introduces an EU-wide neighbouring right in news publications, popularly known as snippet tax, which risks restricting the freedom of quotation online. Yes, quoting from newspapers and quoting from sources now needs a license under this law if they bring it in. Where would we be without being able to quote individuals and organisations? Now, this EU-wide proposal follows unsuccessful national laws in Spain and Germany and conflicts with the EU's treaty commitments. That's very important. But it doesn't really matter, does it? Because these are unelected bureaucrats, again, with their noses in the trough, swimming in money. But it won't bother them. They will do it without any public consultation through unelected bureaucrats on a gravy train. Exactly. I just make these notes here. So it's so lucrative that it removes them from reality. That's the main important point here. Article 13 weakens existing EU legal protections for internet services. It is reported to require sites and apps where users can post material to make best efforts, in inverted commas, to preemptively buy licenses for anything that users may possibly upload. Can you imagine the nightmare of that? Now, this will make it difficult for users, that's an understatement, isn't it? Small publishers and innovators to thrive in the EU single market. I mean, this is unbelievable. And all of those people who still think the EU's a happy clappy, let's all join in, really do need to get real and start looking at what they're actually doing. Actually, this would be impossible for small independent media, and it opens the doors for the authoritative body to close down anyone they want, as the boundaries here are open to whatever the authorities want. Now, it says, we, for example, are already targeted, this is us, by lobbyists and the petty-minded idiots we get all the time over absolute trivia. Now, this new interpretation can in reality be used to silence anyone they want. And of course, you're going to get these lobbyists shutting people down because they don't like what they're saying. In other words, to destroy free speech through these actually unworkable laws, in my opinion, and they look unworkable. But of course, what that means is that they take away any freedom of expression within media, which is effectively what they do. But we've also had numerous videos blocked and taken down by YouTube, and they use excuses like with cyberbullying, and this is relating to the opinions and factual information presented by our guests. Now, and it's it says impossible to obtain licenses for outlets which have no funding like ours. I mean, it'd mean not quoting anything from any written media without the correct permission. It could get rid of Creative Commons agreements straight away, and in effect it would. That's exactly what it'd do. Now, this on the back of the media being controlled effectively by AP and Reuters. Now, two heads of the same snake here, and it would mean an attempt to control all output outside the official narratives, as we've been repeating throughout the show, and for a very good reason. But the agreement is, however, reported to include a mandatory exception for text and data mining. So corporations making money from data mining are exempt. Well, that's great news, isn't it? But the CCIA Vice President and Head of Office, Christine Borgreen, was quoted as saying, "This is a lost opportunity to achieve a balanced and future-proof EU copyright reform. We fear the law could harm online innovation, scale-ups and restrict online freedoms in Europe." No kidding. I mean, that's an understatement there, isn't it? We urge governments and members of the European Parliament to thoroughly assess the consequences of this text before officially adopting it. Well, judging by the quality of intellect these are the ones who are going to pass it, this will probably fall on deaf and manipulated ears and be rushed through as EU legislation on a day of distraction over some mainstream non-news story. Now, just before we wrap up this show, I need to say that I can't get into chat this evening. I'll have to catch up with what people are saying a little bit later on. But I think recapping on what this means, it's very, very important now that people actually start to lobby their MPs. Just let's try it for a change, see if it actually does anything. Not that I think it will, but I think that the so-called alternative media, which is now the real media, really does need to start standing up against this. And with this arrest of Assange, whatever you think of him, and these two new bits of legislation, one that's basically suggestions for legislation, and the other which is actual legislation which will or may be put into place, then it's time to really start taking it quite seriously. I mean, we may be thinking of broadcasting from out of the country. I was talking to somebody else actually who's got a very popular radio show in this country the other day, and they were saying that they may have to leave the UK. Now, this may not be a bad idea with the way things are going here, but it's something to think about. And I really do think that the information that we've put out over the past few years has been absolutely spot on. I look at all the shows that we've done, and I think that's why we're building up listeners. We had many, many thousands of people listening last week, with 7,000 or 8,000, and that was not even actually including some of the other platforms, such as YouTube. So this is all very encouraging, and we don't want to depend on these platforms like YouTube. We're already heavily censored on YouTube. Even if I wanted to try and get some money back through adverts, I couldn't do it. It's all demonetized, our stuff on YouTube, and those videos, the older ones, they're disappearing quicker than ever. It's quite amazing what's going on with that. And yes, it's all stepping up. So we need to get information out as much as possible. And I'm going to now just play our kind of introduction to the bigger picture, because we're getting people actually coming at us from all over the country now, wanting to book events, and we have had a few pulled, and I think we know who's doing it, and we're investigating that at the moment. But this is the general trend. I mean, again, talking to people in the alternative media, they are having the same thing happen. And we're not talking here about anything that's really controversial. We're just talking about anything that actually contradicts or has a different opinion than the mainstream narrative. Now, we're very lucky with the people who actually write into us. I've got some great contributors, and the people that send information into Windows on the World are all very credible. We have very credible sources, and we don't really deal in any of the so-called, conspiraloon type bandwagon jumping that is very prevalent. So in that, sometimes that can mean that your popularity is not as great, because people do tend to love this wacky way out stuff, which I started to look into years ago, and I'm still trying to tie into the bigger picture, because the whole of the ancient past is very important. I find that absolutely fascinating. History is fascinating, but reporting it accurately is the most important thing, and that is really what these shows are about. Something credible, basically an oasis of sanity. And that's what I try and put across. So I'm going to play our jingle for the bigger picture, and then I'll wrap up the show. The Bigger Picture, an amazing series of talks featuring Piers Corbyn, Mark Windows and Sandy Adams, bringing you the most important information you've probably never heard. There is a bigger picture going on behind the repetitive mantras of change, regeneration, diversity, vibrant communities and sustainability.
And they've gone through a plan which is the same on all of them.
Countries weren't taking this on. They just weren't. It was too much trouble. And something happened at the Johannesburg conference in 2002. The corridor of power and control, decoded and explained.
The point is, a lot of these operatives don't know about Agenda 21. They just, that's what that council did, and this is what the Association of London Authorities says we ought to do, so let's do it. And the community. You just close down day centres, close down playgroups, create traffic problems, and destroy meeting places. Aylesbury Estate, the first thing they did once they decided to demolish was knock down the community centre in the middle.
I mean, I used to belong to the Ecology Party years ago, and that was real environmentalism. This has been hijacked. It's a Trojan horse.
They want to treble housing density and put flats for sale, where not a single tenant on the flats in Danbury Avenue overlooking the park is allowed to return to a flat in Danbury Avenue overlooking the park. Not one.
Well, there you are. That's what the Club of Rome actually put in this report. It was their plan to make humanity have a common enemy. They thought global warming would fit the bill.
Labour, Conservative, Green, Liberal, it doesn't really matter, because none of them are going to address the main issue of what this is about, because they can't, because it's above them. Did you know that in 2018, 64% of populations in so-called democracies state their governments rarely or never act in the public interest? Lie one, lie two. There you go. Lie one would be atheism, lie two is organised religion. OK, so let's have the extreme left and the invented far right. UK think tank Demos. The new democracy will work with a combination of government open infiltration and citizen groups taking direct action. Change agents breaking down, you know. Oh no, I've got to go on another course after this, you know. Where there's a problem, there's a solution. Because it means that anyone who gets one of those forms does not have to sign it. And they've stopped it now, right? They've given them back to the council. So that affected hundreds of thousands of people in the country. If you engage with this stuff and learn a bit of it, it's remarkable what you can do. And I'm going to give you some more examples of that as we go along. The global elite's aim is nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to control in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert through frequent conferences and private meetings. Carol Quigley, Tragedy and Hope, 1966. To book our talks on the bigger picture, contact us at info@windowsontheworld.net. Join me, Mark Windows, for Windows on the World live every Sunday 9 to 11 p.m. GMT. Check out our archive and programme stream at windowsontheworld.net. Well, there you go. That's some of what to expect in our talks, the bigger picture. And I've actually put a live events page onto Windows on the World now. So you go to Windows on the World live events and it's all there. And there's links, everything you need to know. And if you wanted to put on a talk somewhere, you've got all the information within the article and live events at windowsontheworld.net. And just to finish off tonight's show, this is from Alt Currency. Well, I've got an Alt Currency. Let's just see actually what it's called. It was I'm getting this from my news feed here. The altmarket.com. It's the altmarket.com. And it's quite an interesting way of wrapping up the show. And it ties into that last comment that I made there about the global governance issue. It says globalists are bringing their one world currency plans out into the open. It's by Brandon Smith. And it says over the past year, the globalists have become absolutely brazen in flaunting their endgame for a single global currency system. Yes, it is time to be concerned, but there are people out there who will tell you that the notion is far-fetched. You know those people, don't you? The people who watch the BBC all day. They will tell you that it is doom porn, and they will tell you it is conspiracy theory. The evidence says otherwise. The evidence says it is conspiracy fact. Even with control of national currencies, the globalists are not satisfied. What they want is global governance. They don't just want the masses to go along with it. They want the masses to beg for it. This is how it's always presented, as a benefit. Everything that's bad is presented as a benefit. But before global governance can be instilled as a necessity in the public psyche and the banking elites established as the benevolent rulers of the planet, several things must be accomplished. One of the first steps to global government would be global economic management and a single world currency. After this is achieved, global government will become much easier to sell to the public. Now, this is from Per again, who sent this in Sweden. He said it's another pretty good article with Brandon Smith. Conspiracy fact. I like the sound of that. Mr. Smith gets a lot of things right, and he also gets some things wrong. Well, don't we all? What I like about his analysis is the psychological part about the psychopathic quest for unlimited power. That's very important. And the narcissistic quest for unlimited adoration. It's a witch's brew for sure. Where he goes astray is that he fails to see, or at least downplays, the structural forces behind it all. And obviously this is from someone who was an economist. The forces to which the captains and managers of the system are as captive as the users and the little people. The view of the ruling elite becomes hackneyed, which is typical for an outsider who has never been on the inside. That's very, very important, because people only ever associate things with their own experiences. So they think it's all too far-fetched. Never been on the inside. And therefore, this had little or no direct contact with these people or personal experiences of how they are actually done, how things get done. To get this story right, you need a combined insider-outsider perspective. That's a really good point, which will give you stereo vision and associated depth of insight. Mr. Smith's portrait gets rather two-dimensional and cartoonish, methinks, he says, but Jose Antonio Ocampo, the UN's USG, is our guy, by the way. He's friends with Lance Taylor, who was my mentor, says Burr, and supervisor in New York. Lance and his British buddy, John Eatwell, put out a number of books and papers proposing new international monetary order. So you're kind of getting it from someone who was an economist here. I was only marginally involved in that endeavour, but did follow the discussion fairly closely and eventually formed myself an opinion about it too. The notion of basing a new system on the SDR, special drawing rights, is fraught with difficulties, in particular that the global payment hub sits with BIS, Bank of International Settlements, in Basel, Switzerland, not with the IMF. So you could not run operations from the IMF without first investing massively in the infrastructure required for the job. The BIS, on the other hand, is often referred to as the central bank of the world's central banks, which is a misleading figure of speech. BIS isn't a central bank at all. It has no facilities for operation. It's an international payments hub and a club, the BCBS, for developing harmonised banking regulation across the globe. So it's a combination of a clearinghouse and a global financial service board, if not authority. To have a global currency with a global central bank, you need to collect all the three functions in one place: clearinghouse, open market operations, and also some regulatory functions, although many of them could be farmed out to a semi-separate regulatory agency. Well, that's highly likely, isn't it? There is no such institution today, and building one would take a lot of time and effort, including investment of financial and political capital. As things stand, there is simply no readiness for it. Now, that might change if conditions change, but I frankly don't see a big plan in the pipeline at this point. Plans are rather loose, but could firm up pretty quickly if conditions went south to the point of calling for rapid action. Now, that's what a lot of people who contribute to this show have been saying for a long time, and something to think about there. That is the bigger picture. This has been Windows on the World, and I think we're just running over time, so that went over very quickly tonight. See you all next week at 9 p.m, and do listen to the shows during the week. Go back into the archive, and hopefully we'll be back next Sunday, and we may even see you on the road with the bigger picture. That's it. Good night, everyone.